Here's another kind of interchangeable parallelism. Another example of interchangeable echo, and this is from Psalm 6:9. The Lord has heard my supplication, the Lord receives my prayer. Now notice here how they are, both lines essentially say the same thing, but there is a slight difference between what he's saying. So for example, a supplication is slightly refining prayer. Prayer and supplication aren't exactly the same thing, but at this point they're pretty much synonymous, maybe a slight nuance and difference. So this is where you do a word study and see if maybe there's something more significant to why the author has chosen these two words. There is also a little bit of difference here between the Lord hearing and Lord receiving. So so there are slight differences that you can maybe consider and see if the author intends something through that. But essentially, it's the same thing twice. And this is the first type of interchangeable parallelisms. Now, another kind is antithesis. Now, this is the opposite. Whereas an echo is the same thing twice, it's the same idea expressed in both lines. The antithesis means he's saying the exact opposite. Here's out of Psalm 1:6, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. I already brought this one earlier, and we said the first one has this positive, the Lord takes care of the righteous. The second line is the way of the wicked perish. So there's that opposite idea there. Now, between those two, think of it interchangeable parallelisms to be have two extremes. On one side, you've got an echo where he's basically saying the same thing twice, and on the other hand, you've got the antithesis where he's saying the opposite in each line. Well, somewhere in between there, you've got your interchangeable contrasts. And this is where it's not really the same thing, it's not really the opposite, but it's somewhere in between, and both lines are interchangeable. Here's one from Psalm 2:9. You shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware. Now, that sounds almost like the same thing, but they're a little different. He's not saying the exact same thing twice. For example, in the first line, it's you, God, breaking them with His strength, right? God is strong like with a rod of iron, versus the victim's weakness here, or the person being judged. God will shatter them because they are like earthenware. So it's not really the same thing twice, in the sense that in both cases it's not emphasizing the strength of God. In the first one, the strength of God is emphasized. In the second one, it's the weakness of those He's shattering them. So you can see it's not exactly an echo, and it's definitely not an antithesis, but it's somewhere in the middle, so we call that an interchangeable contrast. Now, at this point, I wanted to remind you, the goal isn't necessarily to classify these. So if you got to this point and you said, and you're getting a debate about whether this is an echo or a contrast or antithesis, you're missing the point altogether. Really, what you want to do is appreciate what the author is doing. And in this sense, the author is saying God is strong like a rod of iron, and He's going to shatter His enemies like these weak earthenware. And so even if you couldn't put a name to what that is, the fact that you understand and appreciate that, that's the goal. So anyway, just want to kind of model that for you. So that was the first category, that was interchangeable parallelisms. Now let's talk about qualifying parallelisms. And we said that's when the second line qualifies the first. Here's an example from Psalm 5:10, which reads, In the multitude of their transgressions thrust them out, for they are rebellious against you. Now notice that they're not interchangeable. You can't take out for they are rebellious against you, and it's not really interchangeable with the first line. Now there's antithesis or echo. In this case, it's really qualifying what he means by the first. In the multitude of their transgressions thrust them out because they are rebellious against you. So it is really giving a maybe a rationale to the first line. Honestly, I'm going back to this because a lot of parallelisms will fit into this. I think these are very common. Now, expansion parallelisms are not as common, but I think these are probably the most beautiful and the most important to really appreciate because there's so much to them. Let me start off with the first type of expansion parallelism called continuation. In Psalm 5:9, it reads, "There is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue." Now this is continuation because the author starts off with this idea and then continues it on. Now the idea is that there's nothing reliable in what the enemy says, whoever the enemy is at this point. And then now notice this continuation. He starts off by talking about the inward part, and I'm just going to say that's the stomach area. Let's visually imagine that stomach area, and that's destruction. Well, you move upwards towards the throat, which is an open grave, and then you move out a little further, and then there's their tongue, which is flatter. Now, if you do a word study on the Hebrew word for flatter, it's probably the more non-metaphorical sense, or the more literal sense of it, is slippery tongued. That's the less it's a more literal translation. So the slippery, kind of like in English we say he's a smooth talker, they would say something, he has a slippery tongue, and that he's trying to flatter you. And so notice the imagery that the psalmist is using here. The tongue is slippery, which leads into an open grave down into utter destruction. And so it's this continuation from destruction to an open grave, finally to the flattering tongue, where these non-trustworthy enemies are speaking from. And so you've got this visual continuation. So anyway, what you want to do with continuations is pay close attention of the visual aspect of it, the metaphorical side of it, and then look for the linear thought. What is the progression, essentially? In this case, I think it's that ultimately it's utter destruction, an open grave, and then this flattering tongue, this slippery tongue, which leads down into the open grave and destruction. Here's a much more simple parallelism of expansion continuation. In this one, it's "He will tear my soul like a lion." That's the idea that introduces, or the line that introduces the idea of being torn by an enemy the way a lion tears its prey. And then here's the secondary idea being continued, is that now the lion drags away the person. So in the first idea, the soul is being torn apart by his enemy like a lion tears its prey. And then he continues the metaphor by saying, "And he drags me away while there's none to deliver." And the idea is that just the way, when a lion gets his prey, nothing's going to take his prey away from the lion once he tears into it. And he can drag away his food, now he's hunted it, drag it away, and no one's going to take this new catch away from the lion. And so in the same sense, the psalmist is saying, my enemy is tearing my soul like a lion, it's taken me down, and now he's dragging me away. And just like no one can take away the prey from the lion, no one can deliver me from his stronghold, or from his strong grasp. So that's an example of a parallelism of expansion continuation.